the final piece of authoring that we need to cover to be able to give you full control over the water in your landscapes is changing the way that it looks. So we've been able to change the shape and the way that it interacts with the terrain, but at the moment, all the water looks the same. So it's all got this generic bluish tint to it, which could be good enough for you. It actually looks really good, and it's got this kind of bluish depth fall off. So if that's fine for you, then you can stop the video here and move on with the rest of your landscapes. But I do want to be able to control a little bit of how this water looks. Maybe this blue is slightly too blue for my tastes and I want something more clear, or maybe you've got a really murky river and you need to have something that doesn't look so fresh and idyllic. Either way, the things that you will be changing exist in the same area, which is the material settings for these water bodies. So I'm going to just adjust the rivers for now, but the same applies to all of the other water bodies in your scene. To find the materials, we need to select the water actor. So in this case, I'm selecting the water body river by either choosing water body river in the outliner or selecting the icon in the scene view, and then going to the component, just like in some of the other settings, and then the rendering tab. So the component, select the component. So first select the actor, then the component, and then the rendering tab. Under this rendering tab, there are 4 material slots: river to lake transition, river to ocean transition, water material, and then post-process material. So this can get a little bit confusing because there is a separate material for where the rivers meet the lakes, which I don't actually have at the moment. That would be if I did that. Oh, that is not looking good. Probably because I need to reset the transport. There we go. So there is a, let's go back to the material setting. Water river, choose the component, here we go, rendering tab. So there's a separate material for handling how the river blends into the lake, as well as a separate material for handling how the river blends into the ocean. There is also a material for the general river water color. One thing to note is if you go into either the lake or ocean transition materials, scroll all the way to the bottom, under the general settings tab, the parent of this river to lake transition material is the water material river, is the water river material, which means that any settings that you change on the river material, they're going to carry forth, they're going to propagate through to the child material of the lake and ocean transitions. So if you wanted to, let's say, change this water to red, the lake and ocean transitions are going to sort of contain those changes as well. So this doesn't mean that you need to change 3 materials to change the look of your river. All you need to do is change the actual river material itself. However, that being said, the other thing to note is that the river material, the river water material, is different to the ocean water material. So if I select the ocean, go to the component, go to rendering, the water material for the ocean is called water material ocean. The water material for the river is called water material river. And that means that if you wanted to change both, if you have both an ocean and a river and you wanted them both to be red, you would need to go in and change both those materials. That's just something to keep in mind depending on how many different types of water bodies you have in your scene. I'm going to focus on the river because the river is the thing that is actually going to be in my scene. So let's go to the river, select the component, go to the water material, double click on that, and we open up this material instance panel. So if you recall from the materials video, there are 2 different ways of interacting with materials. One is on the materials graph itself, and one is on the material instance panel. So somebody else has gone in and created a very complex material graph, which we could find by going into the parent of this, which is in itself an instance, and then going to the parent of that, which is a material graph. And if you open that up and zoom out, this is an incredibly complex graph that if you are ever interested in how they do materials, you can go in and have a look at this. But it is way outside of the scope of the class to worry about something like this. So I'm just going to close that out. And I'm also going to close out of the water material instance so that I'm just dealing with the river instance. The instance itself is very complex. As you can see, there are so many different settings, and this can all be super overwhelming. They are all useful in their own way if you wanted to get some very specific water look, but for the purposes of this class, I'm not going to worry about most of them. There's a few that we can change which will drastically affect the look of your water, and we'll focus on those for this class. Perhaps the most important settings are the settings related to changing the color of your water, because right now this is a kind of teal blue and looks very fresh and almost like one of those idyllic islands where you see the clear water extend forever. But like I said before, maybe I wanted something a bit murkier or a bit more clear. So to do that, we're going to go to the global vector parameters. And this gives us three options: absorption, scattering, and water area. As far as I've been able to tell, water area doesn't really have much of an effect in the type of stuff that we'll be doing. So really the two ways to change the color of your water are using absorption and scattering. And these are two sort of core principles of how light interacts with water. So it is kind of important that you have a vague understanding of what they will do to the water in your scene. One of the best ways to get that understanding of how these two parameters will affect your watercolor is by playing around with them. So I'm going to activate absorption and then click on the color over here. And this allows me to use this color wheel to change the value of this absorption property. The way that I think about absorption is if light has gone into my water, hit the bottom of the water body, and is now bouncing back towards me, what is the amount and color of light that is allowed to get back to me? And what I mean by that is if I change this color, or rather if I change the value of this color, so right now it's 350, so it's very high, which in my sort of instinctual understanding of this means that there is a lot of light that is allowed back towards me. But if I set that a lot lower to something like 100 or even 50, more and more of that light is being absorbed, and only a little bit of it is being let back out towards me. So with a very blue color, areas where the light has to travel the most, so the deepest areas of the water, are going to let back out the least amount of light. And that's why we get these really dark blue colors over here, and something a little bit lighter blue on the corner. It's appearing as green because my landscape is kind of green, so those two colors are interacting. But if we found something which was more whitish, there we go, like this rock, then areas near the surface of the water are going to be much lighter blue because they've had less time to absorb all the light. And then areas which are deeper, the light has had much more chance to be absorbed by this water. If we set this value really low, that means that almost no light is escaping our water, and in most areas it will appear super dark. One thing about this tool to just be aware of is this is a slider, but the slider's maximum value is 1, and that is nowhere near enough to be a compelling absorption value. So we do need to go in and manually type in the values for absorption. So to get back to my question of what if I wanted a really clear river? If I wanted a clear river, I would want all colors, so something like pure white, coming back to me at the highest possible value. So I think 350 is actually the highest value that makes sense. So I'm going to set pure white at 350, and that means that when light is bouncing back to me through the water, all of the light is coming back, all colors at full brightness. So I'm not losing any light at the bottom of my scene. But even though I've done that, the water still looks a little bit sort of murky or unclear, or like something is interfering. And that's the second value, this scattering. So scattering is as light enters the water, how much of it is scattered back towards me. So absorption is how much light reaches me from the bottom. Scattering is how much light coming from the top is reflected back towards me. And right now, it's pure white at a value of 1. So all of this light that's coming in is being scattered back towards me, and that's why I'm getting this kind of murky, whitish look. If I set that to 0, then no light is being scattered back towards me in the water itself. And because my absorption is set to full, meaning that all the light is reaching me, I've got a very, very clear body of water because there's no light interference through this water. So if I wanted some sort of reddish tint, as if the color of the water itself was a kind of reddish, pinkish hue for some reason, I might go in here and set a pretty red value under scattering and move this brightness value up a little bit so that the red is being scattered back towards me. One of the main differences between absorption and scattering is that scattering, no matter what value you set, it's not going to take away brightness from your water. So it's only ever adding color to the water. So what I was just doing by adding in a little bit of pink, I'm sort of increasing the brightness of the water. Whereas absorption, if I cancel that and set that back to black, whereas absorption does the opposite. It takes away light from the water. So if I set the absorption down to a value like 100, it's actually darkening the parts of the water that it's affecting. And that's why if I set it to something really low, like 10, all of that light in the water kind of goes away. So this can give you some really interesting looks, because if we look at these rocks over here, these rocks kind of fade away into nothingness the deeper the water goes. So that can be a really interesting effect if you're going for something super murky and super sort of scary, where below the surface of the water you can't really tell what's going on. Whereas scattering, so if I set that back to 350, let's adjust this camera's speed. If I set the scattering to even a blue color, so if I set the scattering to something above the black level, it's adding color to the scene, but it's also adding brightness. So I'm never going to use scattering to hide what's underneath the water. It will only change the color of that, of whatever's underneath the water. Just these two tools, absorption and scattering, can create a variety of different effects and looks for your water. And generally, if you start thinking of watercolor in terms of absorption and scattering rather than what color is the water, then you're going to create a lot more realistic scenes with the way that light interacts with your water. So I'll let you go off and explore these tools on your own, but the final thing that I'll do before I do that is I did say, what if this river is murky and sort of dark and you can't really see what's going on underneath? So let's try and use these two settings, absorption and scattering, to create that effect. So the first thing that I want to do is use absorption to try and obscure some of the light that's coming back, because I'm imagining that in a dark, murky river, light isn't really reaching me from the bottom of the river. It's being bounced around and absorbed by whatever particles are in the river. So I'm going to move absorption to a sort of brownish, orangey color, and then bring down this value from 350 to maybe 10. 10 is pretty intense, but that actually might be what I want. Because I'm not, now with a value of 10, I'm not able to really see the bottom of this river. I can see a couple of things, but everything else is kind of murky and obscured, which is good. That's kind of what I want. But now the problem is that the water still looks kind of clear, so it looks like it's just fading out into nothingness and there's not actually any particles inside. So I'm also imagining that as the light comes into the river, it's scattered back from all these particles in the river, in which case I'm going to set the particle scattering to, okay, not something red, something yellow, because dark yellow looks kind of brownish. And now I've got a water surface that appears a lot more murky than the previous one. The final problem in this is that at certain angles the water still looks kind of blue, And what's happening there is that's not the watercolor itself, that's the color of the sky that's being reflected off the water. So to change those parameters, we need to move away from absorption and scattering and move down to the general water shading tab. So this is right at the bottom, water shading. There are many different settings and these can be super overwhelming, but I'm just going to look at specular and roughness for now. So roughness, just like we've encountered before on our landscapes, affects how, well, rough a surface is. This roughness is set really low, so this water is kind of really smooth and shiny, and that's relatively true for most water. Water is traditionally quite smooth and reflective, but if I was to increase this roughness, you'll see that the specular highlights of this surface kind of smooth out a little bit as the surface of the water becomes more and more rough. Similarly, if I activate the specular and reduce the amount of specularity in this water, the brightness of these highlights is going to go down. So this is one way that I can start removing the the shininess of the water and the way that it's reflecting the sky. So increasing the roughness takes away, if we set the roughness really, really low, you'll get these really smooth and shiny highlights, but if the roughness is high, then that sort of evens out across the water. And that actually does kind of work for me in what I'm going for. A quite rough watery surface and then a low specularity. Whereas something that's much more crisp and clean and vibrant might have a low roughness, like the default setting, and a relatively high specular. So it sort of all depends on what you're going for in the quality of your water. The final thing that I'll talk about is, let's say this is right now a very fast moving river, but let's say we went in, selected all the points, went to the selected points option and reduced the speed of the river. So this is actually a very slow moving river now. I don't want it to be moving very fast. I'm going to set this down to 32 and the motion of the river has stopped. However, even though the motion of the river has stopped, it still looks pretty agitated and like there's lots of tiny little ripples and waves. And that's because even if I set the velocity to 0, so what I want to present is that the water isn't moving at all, the texture of the water still looks like it's moving. And that's because in this material, there is some setting that we need to find that's enabling all this sort of moving, agitated, ripply water. The setting that I'm talking about is in the first drop-down menu, so the detail normal map settings, and there are two things that we can adjust to change the amount of water agitation. One is this default distant water speed. So at the moment it's at 0.75. If we set it to 0, the moving of the water stops. But now it looks like the water has sort of frozen in mid-motion. So that's not the only setting we need to adjust. The other is the near normal strength. So this is going to affect how much bumpiness the water has on a really up close level. So when we're right up close to the water, the default is 0.25. If I set that to 0, now we've got a super flat, oops. Damn it. Just need to come back to where I was before. Now we've got a super flat water surface. So using just these two tools, the distant water speed and the near normal strength, we can add a little bit of rippliness back in. And if we set that to 0.5 maybe, then we've got a little bit of rippliness, but nowhere near as intense as before. So using these two tools, we can create a really wavy, agitated water, or something a lot more calm and smooth. So those are the settings that I would suggest starting with when you're beginning to play around with the look of your water. The detail normal, these two, distant water speed and near normal strength, the global vector parameter values, absorption and scattering, and then the water shading roughness and specular. As you can see, there are plenty of other tools to play around with, so I encourage you to do that on your own time and look at some of the documentation and figure out what things are doing what, especially if you have a specific problem that you're trying to solve. But if you're just generally going in for a broad brushstrokes look of the water, those are probably the tools that I would start with. Just to reiterate, what we've been doing right now has changed only the water settings of the river, which means that our lake is going to be the same as it was before. And because our river is so different from our lake now, there's a little bit of a weirdness going on where our lake meets the river. So we will have to, if you wanted to change all the water in your scene, you would have to go to the lake's water settings and adjust those parameters as well. If from the beginning you knew that you were going to be changing all of the water in your scene to look a certain way, what you could do is if you go to the water material, double click on that. So this is the lake water material, but then go into the parent of that, which is water material instance. This is going to be the base water material for all the water in your scene. You could go in here, and this has all the same parameters, so you could go in here and change its absorption and scattering, and then change the shading options and everything like that. But I don't really recommend that, because this is going to overwrite all of the global default water settings for your entire scene, which could become a problem if down the line in the future you want to create a different type of water, and then you have to go back and readjust this water settings, which would break the settings that you've already created. So this is something that I don't particularly recommend, but if from the outset you knew that all the water in your project was going to look the same way, you could adjust this water instance material. But my suggestion is to adjust the river and lake and ocean separately so that you have a little bit of finer control over each. So we've covered how to add water to your scene, how to change the general shapes of that water, and create rivers using the spline tool to draw on the water in different ways to your landscapes, and then how to use the materials to change the color of that water. The final piece of the puzzle that I just want to touch upon before we go, and I won't cover this super comprehensively, but you'll notice that in the lake and in the ocean, not in the river though, there are waves being generated. And this is really cool, and if you had a sort of stormy, high seas type situation going on, then these waves might work well for you. But in my case, I don't really like these waves the way that they're playing out right now. It seems a lot, way too chaotic and intense for what I imagine these waves would be. So I would like to be able to adjust these waves a little bit and see what tools I have to be able to change the shape of the waves themselves. The thing to note is that these waves are a lot different to the waves that I was talking about on the river when we were changing the sort of micro rippling. This micro rippling over here, this is a material based wave. So it's not actually changing the height of the water at all. If we were to look at the water line itself isn't being changed. What's happening is it's just drawing on different materials to a flat waterline that makes it look as though the waterline is moving. However, the waves that you see in the middle of the lake are moving the actual waterline itself. So if you put your camera right at the surface of the water itself is moving up and down. So it's a different system that's manipulating the lake waves than the micro ripples on the river. And it's important to differentiate them, because if you go to the river and search for waves, there's no result. You can't change the waves of the river at all. But if you go to the lake and type in to the details panel waves, you get a drop-down menu that gives you the option to change the wave's source. So if we search for where this actually is, this will live under select water body lake or water body ocean. They both have the waves tool. And under the details panel, with the actor selected, you'll find a drop-down menu for wave. And this gives you a wave attenuation water depth, which I'm not going to worry about too much right now, but the other tool over here is waves source. And this is a separate asset in your project called Gerstner Waves. And there's the lake option, and if we search for the ocean, and we do the same thing, we collapse all of these, search for waves. Under the ocean asset, there is a separate asset for Gerstner Waves ocean. We can search for where this lives in the project. It's under the plugin content. We don't have to worry about where it lives. All we need to worry about is that it does exist somewhere. And this gives you, if you double click on that, it gives you a new window which allows you to control the look of these actual mesh deformation waves in your scene. There's a lot of tools here to play around with, and it's getting a little late into this video, so I'm not going to cover them all. But if you're interested in playing around with the look of these waves in your scene, then this is the tool to do that. Let's just make sure. Okay, so I'm in the ocean waves at the moment. I want to go back into the lake, search for waves, Gerstner Wave Lake, double click on that. So if I start adjusting the settings for this Gerstner Wave Lake over here, those settings should adjust and update in my scene. So Gerstner Waves are a way of generating real-time waves in Unreal by essentially layering on lots of different circles on top of each other. So if we, right now there are 16 different layers of these waves being built on top of each other, but if we set that down to 1, this means that there's just one type of wave. And if we look at how it all works together, let me set the amplitude of this a little bit higher. One wave is essentially moving in one direction. And then if you added on a second wave, it's layering on a second wave in a second direction. And then if you added a third wave, it's layering on a third wave in a third direction. Let me just wait for my computer to catch up a little bit. And so on, until once you layer on enough, like the default, which is 16, I set my amplitude way high. So once you've added enough layering, the system becomes so chaotic that you can't really determine those repeat patterns. And that's how we get this sort of complex wave system happening, even though it's just 16 different single wavelengths being laid on top of each other. And the rest of these tools are ways to adjust how these waves layer on top of each other. So there's the min and the max amplitude, the wavelengths themselves, and then the directions. So the directions gives you a way to, if I set that direction variation at 0, all the waves are now traveling in one single direction, and there's no variation. So you do need a little bit of a direction angle to give you that sort of chaotic nature. I'm just going to set that back to the default. So I'm not going to worry about directions at the moment, save that it's just a way of creating this variation. But wavelengths and amplitudes are the tools that you would use to, if you wanted to make the waves a little bit higher or a little bit smoother, this is what you would use for that. Wavelength controls the minimum and maximum wavelength. So let's just go back to a default of 1 and set the direction to 0 just to demonstrate how these all layer in together. I'll set the amplitude up just so that you can see. So with a max wavelength of 6000, that means that the first wave that is layered is going to have 60 meters between each low point, because 6000 is 60 times 100. Whereas if we start reducing this to something like 100, this means now that the wavelength, or the distance between each peak of the wave, is 1 meter. Right, yeah, 1 meter, there we go. So the max wavelength over here is going to be the size of your first wave, and then the min is going to be the size of the last wave that's laid on. So if we laid on 2, that means that we've now got a 60-meter wave layered on top of a 1-meter wave. So you can already see that even though they're both now traveling in the same direction, there's a little bit more complexity. And if we did something like 3, then there's more complexity on top of that. And 4, 5, etc. up to 16, where you've got really complex waves. But this is looking a bit stupid because our amplitude is way off. And our direction also needs to come back to where it was before. So the wavelength controls the sort of lateral size of the wave, and the amplitude controls the vertical size of the wave. So the higher the amplitude, the more intense your waves are going to be. And this 80 and 4 kind of looks pretty good for me. But if you wanted really intense waves, you could use the amplitude to change that. Direction we've spoken about, and then finally the steepness. The steepness controls, if you really have a look at how these waves are interacting, there's a smooth start and then it peaks, as you would expect waves to do. So this gives you a way to control whether your waves are kind of smooth and low, with no real sort of sharp peaks, or whether the waves do have these sharp peaks. There is a danger that you go too much and you start getting kind of gaps in your waves, like you can see in certain areas. So do be careful of adjusting your sharpness too much. But basically the steepness is a way to say whether you have sharp waves or smooth round waves. Which is all to say, if I wanted this lake to appear a little bit more realistic in my scene, what I might do is set the smoothness to 0 because I don't want any sharp peaks, and then also set the wave lengths way down. So I might start at 1200 and end at 100 maybe. Maybe reduce the number of waves as well, and way decrease the amplitude. So the amplitude I actually want to be max 10. Maybe I want a higher wavelength. Okay, yeah, now I probably need a bit of a higher wave count and a higher wavelength as well. And this way I've got a lake which still has some movement to it, so there's still some waves, but they're nowhere near as like mid-ocean as they were before. Okay, and that's how I would adjust that lake, or at least start adjusting. I then play around with these values a lot longer. And then the same can be said for the ocean. So right now, this is what the ocean's waves look like, but you can go to the ocean actor, go to the ocean settings, and then do exactly the same as what we just did with the lake to change the look of your ocean's water. Okay, I think I'm going to call it there because we've covered all of the fundamental tools related to the water system. I now encourage you to go and create your own water systems and play around with them and see if you can find some inspiring water references and then try to recreate those references in the engine. As usual, if you have any questions or concerns, please post them to the class page. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.